As a neurologist, we were schooled in pretty much staying focused on the brain and exploring the brain, studying the brain, under the mistaken notion that, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. And the reality is that the brain is highly influenced by the gut. And this has relevance for every neurodegenerative condition that has a vowel in its name, basically. So, we now understand that the mechanism that's leading to Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, you name it, autism, ADHD, is one word, and that is inflammation. Where is that coming from? Well, inflam means in Latin to light on fire. And where is the fire? Well, before we get the answer to that question, I would submit that all of the so-called treatments that I had been schooled in and that neurologists still continue to pursue are not looking at the fire, they're looking only at the smoke, meaning they are squarely focused on dealing with symptoms that occur because inflammation has done its dirty deed. Inflammation in the body has its genesis in the gut. And that's a big leap for a brain specialist to take, to recognize that south of the foramen magnum are things happening that influence the brain. We now fully understand that the set point of inflammation in the human body is dictated by the very bacteria and other organisms that live within the gut. It's a very sobering notion for myself as a neurologist and others. It's a sobering notion for dermatologists to recognize that inflammation of the skin is in fact mediated by the gut. That inflammation in the joints, the province of the rheumatologist, mediated by the gut. That diabetes is an inflammatory disorder, as is cancer, as is obesity. So when we get to the source, which is the gut lining, which is maintained by healthy balance and diversity of the gut bacteria, then we begin to understand why, number one, changes in the gut bacteria and loss of diversity can threaten the gut lining, and number two, how that leakiness of the gut or permeability then mechanistically leads to inflammation, the cornerstone of basically every degenerative condition you don't want to get. So it really calls to our attention the need to focus on one word, and that is diversity. That the diversity of the organisms that live within us is absolutely on the front center of the stage in terms of what we need to preserve and also what we need to expand if we're going to have a handle on these really severe global health conditions that we call chronic degenerative conditions. One course of antibiotics will change a person's microbiome for the rest of his or her life. That's a very sobering notion when we revisit what I just mentioned, and that is that, therefore, that changes the bacterial diversity, reduces the diversity, and sets the stage for leakiness of the gut, the cornerstone of all inflammatory conditions. Grain Brain had come out and was really focused on the notion that sugar and carbs are threatening to health in general and specifically to brain health. And how validating it is that just earlier this week, front page of the New York Times, a study, results from a study of JAMA Internal Medicine, showing the level of conspiracy that led us all to the notion that fat is bad and sugar is good, that began in the late 1960s and was highly influential in actual peer-reviewed medical publications from such journals as the New England Journal of Medicine. So I feel a great deal of validation, not only from that report, but all of the studies that are coming out saying, hey, it isn't fat. It was never fat. It's sugar and carbs. And sugar is profoundly detrimental to the diversity of the gut bacteria, and yet another mechanism whereby diets higher in sugar relate to this mechanism of inflammation. In my field, in neurology, we often don't have the luxury of waiting for a double-blind placebo trial for people with Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease when these studies may take 10, 15, or 20 years to be validated and published. We owe more to our patients. And as I began seeing the literature in the past 5 to 10 years that strongly correlated elevated blood sugar, for example, to risk of Alzheimer's disease, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, September 2013. Here's a study, among many, many studies, that showed, for example, that people who had even mild elevation of blood sugar to like 105, which no one's going to get excited about, these people, followed for about 7 years, had a dramatic increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. I thought that was damn important. Did I go beyond what is typical and publish a book talking about this and warning people to regulate their blood sugars? You bet I did. Now, turns out that we were right. There are two things you need to bring about change. You need knowledge, and then you need action. And as it relates to your health, I'm doing my best for the former to provide people what I think is the best information. That is, we need more dietary prebiotic fiber. We need to reduce our carbohydrates. We need to get rid of our sugars. And we need to welcome healthful fat back to the table. And we need to exercise every single day. Do I make statements before there is that level of scientific certainty? I do. I do, based upon well backed up hunches. And here are the hunches. Cut your sugar, exercise, on and on. And ultimately, primum non nocere, above all, do no harm. I don't see the harm in telling people you should exercise, cut your sugar, welcome healthy fat back to the table, use coconut oil, take some MCT oil, monitor your vitamin D level, make sure your magnesium level is adequate. There's no downside, there's only an upside. Ronald Reagan said that status quo is a Latin term for the mess we're in. We have to have outliers in order to move the ball down the field. If we're all parroting the same notions, then there'll be no progress. And now we learn that this hallowed gold standard peer-reviewed medical journal has been feeding us BS for 40 years, and it's breathtaking how pervasive is the notion that we should have our whole grain goodness and don't worry about sugar, but the real culprit is fat. The balance of information that we have now allows us to say that it makes sense that sugar is bad news, that the hidden sources of sugar are ubiquitous in our culture. And it's not just sugar per se through the mechanisms of insulin and insulin sensitivity reduction and leptin sensitivity reduction and all the things that sugar does, glycation of our proteins, etc. We now look at the higher sugar and carb diet through the lens of the gut bacteria, getting back to our original topic, and the profoundly detrimental effects in terms of reducing that diversity that we need to have in the gut bacteria brought on by diets high in sugar, or even worse, brought on by artificial sweeteners. People consuming artificial sweeteners have a much higher risk of obesity. On the outside, that makes no sense whatsoever. Where you're drinking a couple of liters each day of a drink that has not a single calorie, not a single gram of sugar, and yet you're getting fatter. Researchers looked at that, and they did human and animal studies, and they found that the reason is squarely with the changes occurring in the microbiomes. And in fact, took their study to a crossover between animals and humans, induced the microbiome changes in humans by giving them artificial sweeteners, transplanted their stool in the laboratory animals, and even the laboratory animals suddenly got fat with no change in their diet. The other relationship with the artificial sweeteners that's so absolutely fundamentally related to the changes in the microbiome is this incredible increased risk of type 2 diabetes in people consuming artificial sweeteners. Makes no sense. Hey, I was drinking Coke, but now I'm drinking Diet Coke, and I've doubled my risk for type 2 diabetes. It all settles back with the changes in the microbiome. We got to screen this information out because people are truly under the wrong impression here that getting off sugar-sweetened drinks in favor of artificial sweetened beverages is a good choice. It is not. We tell women when they are pregnant, be careful now because you're eating for two. Well, I would say that what we should be saying to everyone, male and female, pregnant or not, is that we are all eating for 100 trillion, meaning that the foods we consume have a huge influence on the health and the diversity of the microbes that live within us. So when we start looking at our food and other lifestyle choices through the lens of the gut bacteria, and the role of then the health of the gut in terms of inflammation, then our food choices become really, really important. Medicine has pretty much been focused on this notion of germs. Just the word germ connotes negativity from the outstanding work of Dr. Louis Pasteur. There's no derogatory sense in my statement, but that said, most germs in our bodies are there to help us. We've got this beautiful symbiotic relationship, giving them a nice, warm, dark place to live and feeding them, and in turn they are making our neurotransmitters, making vitamins, regulating inflammation, controlling the set point of immunity, controlling our appetite, our metabolism, our regulation of sugar. The list goes on, and that's what we get back from them. And we're talking about a mechanism of transferring information, genetic information, through the carriers of this information being bacteria, that has a very, very long history, very highly conserved, and we have to respect that. We should talk about preservation of the gut bacteria. And again, starting with birth. If you can opt for vaginal delivery, you should do so, and here's why. We've covered that. But I think so much of what people do these days threaten their gut bacteria. I mentioned overusage of antibiotics, not just taking them when you have a sniffle, but the antibiotics we are exposed to in the foods that we eat. The fact that glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, is patented by Monsanto as an antibiotic. So much of our food has residues of glyphosate, meaning we're consuming antibiotics when we eat those glyphosate-treated foods, which include wheat, even though wheat is not GMO because it allows the wheat to ripen more quickly, along with corn, soy, etc. Many of the commonly used medications that people think they must take are related to dramatic changes in the microbiome. For example, what are called the proton pump inhibiting or acid blocking drugs that Larry the Cable Guy tells us we've got to take. And frankly, we don't need to be doing that. We don't need to be suppressing stomach acid by and large. So many people are taking the Pepsids, the Prilosec, the Zegarids, all these drugs that change the pH of not just the stomach, which has its own set of consequences, reducing B12 absorption, affecting enzyme activity, but also changes the pH for the entire rest of the gut where our friends are living in their neighborhood, our bacteria. So there are dramatic changes that happen in the gut bacteria when people are taking these drugs, and that increases their risk for a potential for death from what's called Clostridium difficile infection, or C. diff, which kills about 30,000 Americans each year. A study that looked at over 70,000 individuals and followed them for 5.5 years found that those individuals taking these proton pump inhibitors, these acid-blocking drugs, had a 44% increased risk of developing dementia. When we change the pH, we change the bacteria, and there's hell to pay. We're just beginning to see the data that's looking at long-term effects of drugs in terms of their side effects that may be related to changes in the microbiome. So what's the good news? So the question then is, what can we do to reestablish diversity of bacteria in the gut and pave the way for better health and reduce our risk for inflammatory issues like coronary artery disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, cancer? And I think the first thing is we've got to focus on the diet. We need a diet that has a dramatic reduction of sugar and carbohydrates, much, much higher in fiber, and specifically prebiotic fiber. That's the fiber that nurtures the gut bacteria. Prebiotic fiber-rich foods are those like jicama and dandelion greens, garlic, onions, leeks, asparagus. These are foods that have lots of prebiotic fiber and will nurture the gut bacteria. Eat fermented foods like kimchi and cultured yogurt that contain good bacteria. Get a high-potency probiotic. All important things.